Conflict feels like it's everywhere right now. According to the Workplace Conflict and How Businesses Can Harness It to Thrive report, the following statistics show just how much it is in the workplace. So 85% of employees deal with conflict on some level. 12% of employees say they frequently witness conflict among the senior team. 49% of conflict is a result of personality clashes and warring egos. And 34% of conflict is caused by stress in the workplace. So obviously conflict is not new. So why are so many leaders reporting that they are spending an excessive amount of time trying to resolve conflict among their staff and even their customers?
Well, I don't know how you guys feel about this, but in our consulting, I'm finding more conflict than ever before. And it just seems like it's not only the frequency, but the intensity that's happening. So I agree. It is, from the beginning of time, a natural, reoccurring event. It helps teams to form, actually. They need conflict. But the inability to resolve it productively seems to be the key to me.
You mentioned a couple of statistics there and a couple of themes. I'm seeing two. One that I think has been around forever, and one that I think a company, an organization can address. The first is ego. Right? When I see organizations thriving and doing well, I often see humility as a character trait amongst those who are leading. I don't think that's changed forever, but the idea of understanding who's on your team, that continues to change. The analytics and the way that we can understand how other people on our team accept feedback, navigate crisis or stress. The TTI work that we do, in my experience, whether it was our Emerging Leaders Initiative or just working with clients around the country, helping them to understand how the other people around the table think has been so strategic in some of the work that I'm doing. So one has kind of been around forever, and one continues to grow, where I think you can really know the people that you're working with.
You know, it's interesting, in having taught in a college before, the word university is the blending of unity and diversity. And what's interesting is, there's way more diversity of perspective now than there is unity. And so teams, organizations have to find that common ground. And part of the common ground issue, it involves compromise. And part of it is also being less sensitive and fragile, because now, sometimes, even with innocent issues and ideas and perspectives, triggers a firestorm of conflict. And I do think that is something very different that wasn't as prevalent if you go back a few decades. So the diversity piece is winning, the unity piece is probably losing, and we got to figure out how to keep the benefits of the diversity of perspective and then weave in together the common ground.
Yeah, I think that in some ways this is just reflective of our society at large, right? I mean, you look at violent crime, road rage, all the things that just seem to be on the rise, whether it's since the pandemic or maybe even before the pandemic. So I think in some ways, this is what we're seeing in the broader society. But I think the key is what Jay just said. We actually need conflict among a leadership team. I often tell my clients that we want the best idea to win, which means we have to disagree with each other in order to wrestle with an issue and get to the best decision. But it's about how you manage that conflict, as Dave said. So not letting it escalate, not taking it personally, because you understand each other and you understand how people feel about a situation.
Well, Gray, as a former military guy, you would call that rules of engagement, right? In other words, teaching within the dynamic of the culture of the organization how to fight right.
Yeah, I often call it ground rules.
Yep.
When we're part of a leadership team. What are the ground rules? We want everybody to speak. It's okay to disagree, but we've got to come to decisions here, and we're going to respect each other at the end of the day.
Yeah, and when we work with the team, we often do an assessment, and one of the assessments we look at is your ability to have conflict and resolve it. I think the problem with conflict, it's become a thing unto itself, and it's lost its context of relationship. So we have conflict resolution in that, but are we really putting it in the context of a relationship? And I think our isolation, working from home, working apart, the last couple of years of being online, we're sort of losing that relational connection that allows us to want to push through the conflict. I was talking with a leader earlier today. He has 2 people on his staff, and they are just knocking heads, And their solution has been, we will work apart from one another. We won't talk with one another. And what does that do to the organization? And how toxic does that make that environment for the rest of the people?
And we've all heard of the, the typical responses to conflict, right? The fight or flight mechanism. But really, it's actually referred to as F3. There's 3 Fs: fight, flight, or freeze. And all 3 of those actually have an appropriate place, right? There are times that you need to wrestle it through. There's times you really need to just stop. And there's times you need to withdraw. And we usually mix them up. That's where the conflict comes from, using the wrong F strategy at the wrong time, rather than being able to bring those worlds together and pick your strategy appropriate for the conflict at hand.
Yeah, the swing of the pendulum can be, we're not going to fight at all. We're going to have peace at any price. And the price is unhealth for the organization.
And I would say, Dave, on top of that, I do feel like conflict, as we would all agree, right? It's been around since the creation of mankind. The issue, I think, is we know it's accelerated some, but I do believe that the amount of media has accentuated that, because there are times when people start to believe that it's catastrophic. And yet sometimes the statistics don't show that's just, we're hearing more of it now. When we were younger, you didn't hear as much about it because you didn't have access to unlimited 24-hour-a-day news feeds. And so now you could start to over accentuate conflict and think it's everywhere.
And you have to have somebody to blame.
Yeah, true.
I think one principle about conflict that I think is healthy is when one person leaves feeling like they've just lost, right? They didn't get their point across. They didn't have an opportunity to speak. It's wins and losses. But when people agree to collaborate through conflict, it allows for a better result because everybody's speaking into it. It's not just, yes, we're going to go and do what you said and mine lost. No, it's like we come to a better conclusion. And then I remember reading an article in the Harvard Business Review about the capture of Osama bin Laden. And the amount of preparation that went into that. They actually tested it time after time after time, what it would be like if one helicopter went down, 2 went down, and ultimately 1 did. And they were so prepared for what that result was going to be that I think conflict is a lot like that. If we reflect on how conflict has been resolved and used in the past, it often can be a catalyst for future growth. Here's an interesting question about conflict. How much does generational issues play into this whole idea of conflict within organizations? So I wonder what people 30 and under think about conflict and the style in which they lead compared to those maybe in their 40s or 50s, and how that impacts them.
We've really seen that in working with families and family businesses to some degree. What worked for mom and dad in the family business is so different now for the children. And we all have that baggage, the intergenerational legacies that we carry. Is conflict good? Is it not? My wife grew up in a family where conflict was forbidden. You just didn't deal with conflict. I came from a family where we dealt with everything. Imagine the first 3 years of our marriage as we were sorting that out and came to really see that conflict is important to our relationship.
Well, if you think about the Industrial Revolution, and when people started working in factories and they were just thankful to have a job, they were able to buy a house. They never were able to leave that job, and they weren't able to ever leave that house. They had to learn to work through difficulty. Now, with mobility and education, people can quit easily. I have a conflict with you, I'm leaving. I don't like my neighborhood, I leave. My kids aren't getting along at school, they find a new school. The problem is then you never learn the skill set of how to, in a sense, fight wisely, how to navigate and how to negotiate, because you don't have to.
I recently spoke to a group of business students at a university in Philly, and they embrace this idea. They want a voice at the table. They want to be able to speak into the decisions and the conflict that exists within their organization. And it's interesting to hear them speak. The word that they used was this idea of they tend to stick to principles. I was working with one business owner where the kids were kind of coming into the business, and they were much more principled. They wanted their point across, even if it meant losing money in some respects, because the principle about that piece of conflict that they wanted to have a voice in was so important to them.
One of the generational differences I'm seeing is the different expectations that the older generation had and the younger generation have in terms of their roles as husbands and wives and parents. And it sometimes causes a conflict because it's, well, when I was your age, I did this, and why don't you just suck it up and do that? And sometimes we have to remind those clients that things have changed, and that the times aren't like they used to be. And there are different expectations with dual working spouses and different things that the expectations are just different in the younger generation. And I think employers would do well to sort of embrace that and understand it rather than trying to wish they were the way they had been.
That reminds me, Jay, of the coaching mountain that you've used in consulting a lot, how to reduce the likelihood of conflict by starting at the bottom with expectations. What is that concept? How would that work in an organization, help reduce that frequency and intensity?
Yeah, basically the performance, it's out of a field called human performance engineering. And about 80% of disagreements between a supervisor and an employee can be resolved by two things: clear expectations and clear feedback. Both of those cost nothing. They're 100% free. And they have found that about 80% of performance problems can be resolved at that level. Once you get higher on that performance mountain, it gets more expensive and more difficult. You may be asking something from a person that they just can't give you. They don't have the competency, they don't have the knowledge, they don't even have the capacity. But expectations and feedback are free.
Yeah. And that's where I think a lot of people jump to motive. Your motive for not performing is this, when it might be something very different.
Yeah. In fact, we hear that all the time, right? As we work with different employees and nonprofits and churches and businesses, how many of them say, I never hear how I'm doing. I never have feedback provided to me. And that's why every organization needs good feedback if they want to keep, performance high and conflict low.
Yeah, and I actually think it's not just, am I getting feedback from the person that I report to, but what's it like to get feedback from the people who are kind of similar in my role, but even more strategic? What's it like to get feedback from people that report to me? How am I treating you? Am I clear in my expectations? Are the goals that we've set realistic for you? And I think sometimes we have this I'm good with the person above me, but what's it like to cultivate that with the people who actually report to me? And how am I doing in that relationship? I think that's where you get a ton of valuable feedback.
Billy, I talk to my coaching clients about that a lot, and there's a book called The Power of Moments that calls that tripping over the truth. It's sometimes as an individual, it really reveals things to you. I have a personal example of that. I did some 360 feedback when I was leading an organization, and I received feedback from my team that when I would show up late to meetings, they felt very disrespected. Now, that may seem obvious to you, but at the time, it was an aha moment to me. I never meant it to be disrespectful. I just got caught up and lost track of time, busy doing things. And once I heard that they were feeling disrespected by my showing up late to meetings, I changed my behavior. So I think as an individual who's trying to improve, it's really important. I also think, Jay, to your point about the performance feedback perspective, it's also really important because as I have managed and evaluated people, I often have blind spots. They might do a great job of managing up, but I have no sense how they manage their team or how they interact with their peers. But that 360 feedback that you're referring to really helps to eliminate those blind spots.
Billy, I'm thinking about the whole notion of principles. And there are times when principles become my little idiosyncrasies that I hang on to. And the less missional, the less driven I am to the product, whatever it is we're trying to accomplish, I start to indulge those minor principles, and they become my points of aggravation and then conflict. Why even resolve a conflict? Because there's something better we want to do together. And that's what drives us forward. Otherwise, it's just looking for the next fight to pick because I'm defending my ground versus I need you. I've got to resolve this with you.
Which is back to that relational versus positional. And, I don't know if your experience is like mine. Sometimes I read comments in social media and the venom, the poison, the just very punitive language, they would never say that to your face, but they would say it online. And if they'll say it about somebody else, they'd say it about you, right? And so I think we're breeding some of that in our own culture.
Well, we've tried to practice some of these principles in helping clients with conflicts. When there's a conflict, first go personally. If you can't go personally, pick up the phone. If you can't pick up the phone, write an email, but don't send it for 24 hours. And read it aloud to yourself first and look for the tone. There's a couple of things that have really helped.
And I just think the humility piece of knowing that we are better together. I will say it. I'm better at what I do because of the people around this table, period. Right? And so I look at it like there's something that we can accomplish together that none of us could accomplish on our own. And I love that about work. And I think, I love what you just said, Paul, but I really think we have to come to these organizations and where we serve and lead with a spirit of humility. There has to be a posture that I don't know it all. I don't have all the answers. This is the type of person that I am. And somebody may actually be better at this, and I need their feedback.
Do you ever feel like you're getting sucked into a role? It was Stephen Cartman back in the 60s that said, every time you got a victim, you have to have a persecutor. If you have a persecutor, you better go find a rescuer. And that those roles just kind of rotate. Sometimes I feel, especially in working with clients, they want us to be the rescuer. Well, it won't be long before we're the villain, right? And you guys experience any of that?
It can be very tempting to dive into that, particularly if you're a fixer, and we love to be the hero of the story. I think the challenge for us as consultants, back to your point, Billy, is that humility that says we're not the point. We're trying to facilitate, we're trying to enable, but we are not the point. We're going to make you better.
Yeah, and I would say it depends on the nature of the conflict. I think sometimes, we need to be the rescuer. Somebody does need rescued. Other times we may be premature in rescuing and not help them learn the skills necessary, right? It's almost like, growing up in my neighborhood, when do parents intervene? Well, back then, hardly ever, right? The kids figured it out. They figured it out on the street corner, and the next day they played basketball again together. And so, you rescue too quickly, they don't learn. But there are times and seasons when somebody needs us to jump in quickly and actually resolve it quickly because it may be dangerously toxic.
And let me make one point about this posture of humility. A posture of humility is not a position of weakness, right? There are times when you're going to have a posture of humility and act with strength. And then there's times you're going to have to wait and allow for things to play out. I want to be very clear that a posture of humility is not a posture of weakness. It's really a posture of seeing where things are moving and being able to speak to the degree in which you need to be able to speak.
Well, Billy, to that point, and reflecting back on what Jay just said, I really think that often when someone comes to us as a leader and says, this person has really been unfair to me, they haven't been kind to me, whatever the complaint is, it's so easy to jump to their rescue because you're only hearing one side of the story. When how often has it happened to us where once you hear the other side of the story, there was plenty of blame on both sides of this. And so I think, the concept of listening well to both sides of the story, trying to be objective and saying, okay, what would an objective person, how would they evaluate this situation, and really try to peel that onion to get to some of the root causes of the conflict.
Well, Gray, that's a great point. And I think just this brief conversation on conflict had a lot of value in it. It shows you how relevant it is that we can talk in depth about that topic for, an extended period and never really run out of information because we're seeing it and feeling it so much in organizations and in culture.